This is the Business of Story. I'm Park Howell, and I am delighted that you are here with us today. How many times has someone told you a story, and when they finish, you went, okay, what's the point? You may have been entertained, but you were left wondering what was the big idea the storyteller was trying to communicate. This form of storytelling for story's sake seems to be prevalent in business communications more than ever because everyone is telling you to tell a story. But you're in luck because this won't happen to you with your stories after listening to today's guest, Francisco Mahfuz, a national champion speaker and storytelling coach who has recently guided several of his clients to the rarefied air of being among the top 3% of TED Talks that go viral. Why? Because he helped them find their big idea and communicate it through a story that started with a crystal clear point. I was sitting in a crowded Tucson hotel conference room watching his PowerPoint presentation when I thought a 3D pterodactyl was going to leap from his deck and chomp off my head. The he I'm referring to was a brilliant social scientist from Phoenix, presenting to a group of nonprofits about nutrition deserts in, well, the desert. At least that's what I think his big idea was about, because he was so obtuse about the needs of his audience that he never got to his point. His slides were so crammed with numbers, charts, lines, and scribbles that it occurred to me that they were busier than an autostereogram. You know what those are? That's just a big word for those two-dimensional images that when you stare at them, they create an optical illusion, revealing a three-dimensional image. That's when my exhausted brain chuckled at the idea of a 3D dinosaur emerging from his intricate maze of detailed data. I couldn't have been more stupefied by his presentation. And it also occurred to me that maybe he was the dinosaur in the room, rendering his message extinct by the meteor of metrics he projected upon us. Another brilliant mind mired in his message. What was his point? I still wonder today. Well, let's start with the first big mistake we all must overcome to make sure our big idea lands immediately with our audience, even if you are a great storyteller. Otherwise, you'll lose them and lose them fast.
And then even if the story was perfect and you just missed that couple of lines that you could have used to set that up, then it just doesn't feel earned. The point of the story or the learning of the character or the transformation does not feel earned, and that just makes people not buy it. And that's often the most common mistake, or the biggest mistake people that actually know how to tell a good story will make, because they haven't paid attention to just this very basic thing of setting up opposites.
Francisco Mahfuz, the host of the Story Powers podcast, has always loved speaking, even before he had anything useful to say, or so he told me. Today, he's a keynote speaker and storytelling coach trusted by global organizations to inspire teams and individuals to communicate more effectively through intentional storytelling. And his clients are impressive, including PepsiCo, Hewlett-Packard, the United Nations, and Cornell University. So he's here with us today to help you make your points not only sound, but crystal clear and powerfully through the stories you tell. Please welcome to the Business of Story, Francisco Mahfuz. Francisco, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks for having me, Park. It's been a while. I've been a big fan of the show. Really glad to be here.
And you're coming to us from Barcelona, right?
Yes, I'm coming to you from Barcelona, from my daughter's bedroom. I don't think your audience can see that, but this is where we get the highest sound quality in this house. And I know how much you care about the sound quality of this show. So that's me, locked in my daughter's bedroom, ready for you.
And why is that? Does she love drapes and all that stuff that cushion the sound?
Well, no, it is a much simpler reason. We get the better quality of sound in this bedroom because this is the bedroom that when the door is locked, there are no children running around in. The rest of my
Hmm.
house right now has two very young children running around and screaming their heads off. Whereas if I lock myself in here, I can keep the chaos at bay. That's
Ah,
that's really why.
that's perfect. Now, did you grow up in Barcelona?
No, no, I did not. I uh, This is where things get complicated because I'm a little bit like a crap Jason Bourne. I've got all the passports but none of the skills. So I was born in the U.S. I was born in Philly. My dad was taking a master's in PhD in the U.S. And I went to Brazil when I was only 2 years old. That's where my family was originally from, and I grew up there. But then I've been out of Brazil since I was 21 or something. So I've been out of Brazil now. By this point, exactly as long as I was in Brazil, and that was London and then Spain. So not from here.
And how did you get into the storytelling business?
So I think that the answer to the question is first of all I got into the speaking business, and that came strangely that came before the storytelling business because what happened was one day I got woken up by my wife and I heard the scariest words I had ever heard in my life, and they were, "Francisco, I'm pregnant again." And my wife started crying, and I started crying too. Her tears were of joy, mine were not completely of joy. Um, but as over the next few days, where I kind of got myself used to the idea that we're going to have a second kid that we had absolutely not planned for, I just had one of those moments where like you see your whole life ahead of you. And I was doing this super boring like financial advisory job, and I thought, I have this boring job where I have to wear a suit and tie to work. I've got married with two kids. This is the rest of my life. This is it. Nothing different is ever going to happen, and I just kind of panicked. Like I immediately went into a midlife crisis, and I had been toying around with the speaking thing for years. Right, I had been doing Toastmasters, taken part in some competitions. I won some stuff, and my friends always said, "You're good at this stuff. Why don't you do this professionally?" I'm like, I got a good job, and I want to rock the boat. And then a few days after I found out about this other kid, one of my friends said, "Listen, we're starting a professional speakers association in Spain. I know you've said no, but I just wanted to ask again." I'm like, "Yes, yes, I'll do it, whatever." So I got into speaking then, and very quickly, you have to decide what you're going to speak about, right? You can't speak about everything. And someone asked me a question that was very insightful. He asked me, "Do you want to be a speaker who trains or a trainer that speaks?" And I said, "Well, I much prefer to be a speaker that trains." And he says, "Well, then you need to pick a topic that people pay to have you speak." And like many people that get into this from a public speaking sort of background, I was like, "Oh, I can talk about public speaking and communication." It's like, okay, fine, but nobody's hiring a keynote speaker to talk about public speaking, right? That's not viable. So break public speaking into a whole bunch of areas and decide which one is the one you like most, the one you're better at, and the one you can see yourself doing for at least the next 5 years, maybe 10. And as soon as I did it, it was like, okay, well, it's storytelling. There's no question about it. And that's when I decided, okay, I'm going to focus on the storytelling thing. And now it seems crazy that I would ever have focused on anything else. But back then, it wasn't as obvious to me as perhaps it was to other people that had heard me speak back then.
Well, I'm always curious why storytelling, and maybe let's set that first question up with a question before it. When did you know you were a good storyteller? Were you like a young man, kid, or did it come to you later in life?
So it's so I'll give you the answer that I normally give people, right? And I'm already going to tell you that this answer is only half true. Uh, so the answer is that I must have been I think I was 12 years old. I was in seventh grade, right? I'm in seventh grade, and my teacher says, "Francisco, why don't you come up here and tell a story in front of the whole class?"
And this is in Philly where you
No,
were
this was
growing
in
up?
Brazil. This was in Brazil,
Oh,
right?
Brazil.
Yeah.
Okay.
So my class had about 40 students, and I look around, and half of them are horrified for me, for what's about to happen, and the other half are looking pretty chuffed to see me crash and burn, right? So as I'm walking up there to the front of the class, I'm realizing that yeah, I'm kind of terrified, but I'm also a little bit excited because I was never really a popular kid. Through a lot of financial sacrifice, my mom sent me to this really fancy private school, and we had a scholarship and everything. And that meant that because I didn't have as much money as the other kids. Just wasn't like them, right? Like there was some stuff I just couldn't do. So whenever, I couldn't dress the way they did. Whenever there was a school trip, I usually couldn't go to those trips. When people invited me to their massive houses, I felt kind of embarrassed to invite them back to mine, and that just made me different. And at that age, being different is not a very good thing. So I thought, so I'm walking up and I'm thinking one of these things that I think only kids can think. And what I'm thinking is, what if they really like my story? What if it changes everything? What if this story makes me, liked by all the other kids? So I get up there and I tell the story, and they love it. I mean, they're laughing, they're cheering, they're asking for more. And like at that moment, I felt like the most popular kid in that school. And that was honestly the first time I came across the power of storytelling. But I kind of didn't learn the lesson, right? I came across like, oh, this is amazing. But as soon as the bell rang and I went out of the classroom, that was it. I wasn't immediately popular with all the other kids because perhaps because I just wasn't doing the thing that made them like me in front of everyone. I wasn't doing that when I was out of the class. I wasn't telling stories. I wasn't communicating that way. So I only came back to it much later when I got into public speaking. And I used to build these really convoluted speeches, like it was like a Tarantino type of movie of a speech, lots of moving parts. I have no idea how I managed to get those things into my head. um, and one day there was a competition, and they told us, I had the speech prepared, I had practiced to death, and they told us a day before, I think, just to remind everyone, you've got 5 minutes tomorrow. And I'm like, hold on, don't I have 7.5? And then I tried starting to cut my speech down, and I just couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. And I thought, okay, either I back out, which I didn't want to do because I had people coming over to see me, or maybe I just tell one of the many funny stories that I have from my life. And I was like, I tagged a little intro, tagged a little ending to pretend there was a moral of the story. And I just told this funny story about me and my wife in Tuscany and her losing her keys and us trying to find the keys from the smell of her pee because she had peed when she lost the keys. So the whole thing was kind of hysterical, and it was super funny. People liked it. It was the least I ever practiced for a speech, and people really liked it. I won the competition, and I'm like, hold on, I practiced that thing 5 times, and it was one of the best things I've ever done on a stage. And all it was a story with a couple of beats added to it. Like, maybe this is what I should be doing whenever I tell a speech.
Well, it was your story, so you
Yeah.
knew it inside and out, and you could read the room and have some fun with it,
Yeah.
and just roll with it. And
Yeah.
you came across certainly as just yourself,
Yeah.
not like some dude that prepared a speech. And boy, that is so much more ingratiating to an audience
Yeah.
than having to sit and listen to a speaker. Do you remember the story in the seventh grade? Can you share that story with us?
I kind of remember it. It wasn't so it wasn't like an anecdote, right? What it was is this was Portuguese class, which would be our version of English class, where you write essays and stuff. And I don't even remember why, but this I had written this sort of funny story about a detective that was like always hungry, and smelled bad, and he was got involved into investigating the weirdest crimes possible, which was kind of half plagiarized, like the idea from some other famous writer. But I found that like I kind of copied the guy's style when I wrote this story, and I could just make up my own stories in a similar style, and they were funny and people liked it. And I remember, I think for the rest of that school year, they kept asking, "Can we hear more about what is a detective? What is it? Tapeworm." And that was a detective tapeworm. Like, can we hear more stories about detective tapeworm? And I'm like, I guess I could write some more. And then I would write them, and the teacher was like, okay, we kind of done with the lesson. I can't let you go. Francisco, have you got any of those stories to tell? I was like, sure. And I had some. So that I can't remember what they were exactly, but it was all like he got into trouble because he was always broke and hungry, and not a particularly good detective. That's what
Well,
it was.
what's interesting to me about that is you said you felt like a little bit of an outcast. You weren't blending in, and you didn't come from the wealthy families of the other kids there, and made you feel bad about that. I totally understand that. But storytelling became your currency. It's what people said, hey, let's go see Francisco. Let's hear another story from Francisco, and it evened that playing field. Maybe even gave you a leg up on a lot of those kids.
I think it's communication is always something that can set you apart in any sort of context, professional or personal. And I had this advantage of no self awareness. So whenever we had a group, we had some sort of group. Project or essay, whatever we had homework we had to put together, and we had to present it in front of the class. I was always the one who said, "I don't mind. I'll get up there and I'll talk." Right? I'm not particularly ashamed of this context doesn't scare me. So being able to talk off the cuff and be kind of humorous and occasionally get some story in there, that always helped. It was never a bad thing in my life when I look back that I was able to communicate well. But it took me quite a while to remember that I was good at stories and to make a conscious effort to tell them and make them part of my communication. And I think it's something that happens to most people, because to some degree we all tell stories. We tell stories to our friends all the time, but we don't exercise that muscle in a different context. Right? A lot of people at work don't ever tell a story, but then they get to the bar with their friends, something happens and they go, "Ah, you won't believe what just happened to me. I went into the bathroom and this guy," right? But they don't do that at work. It's the last thing from their mind to say, "You won't believe what just happened when I was doing this factory inspection. I went in, I was expecting to see this and this happened." They just say, "Okay, what's the data from this?" And they extract the data, communicate the data, and then nobody cares.
Yeah, we got to turn that data into drama. That's for sure. Now, you and I are among a growing group of storytelling coaches out there in the world. And one of your positions is that most storytelling advice is a waste of time. Why is that?
Yes, because a lot of storytelling advice focuses on, and I'm very aware who I'm saying this to, but a lot of storytelling advice focuses on structure. Right, a lot of storytelling advice is, you should use, the hero's journey, which only people who have never tried doing that will ever advise anyone on. You should use the hero's journey. You should use this structure. You should use this structure. You should use the Freytag's pyramid, and you should do this other thing. Fine. But the problem is that to most people, what they're not trying to do, like in their head, when they're trying to tell a story, what they're not trying to do is say, let me get this presentation and organize it in story shape. If that's what you're trying to do, then Freytag's pyramid is great. The ABT that you teach is fantastic. There's a lot of structures that immediately apply themselves to that. Okay, but that is not necessarily storytelling, right? You're shaping things in the form of a story, but it doesn't mean that people are going to actually tell a story. So what I say to them is, listen, if what you're trying to do is organize your thoughts in the shape of a story, structure is amazing, right? It's the best thing you're going to do. If you're trying to actually tell a story, the very first thing you need to do is to find a story. Because if you don't find a story, what are you going to do? Because you're not writing fiction. So you can have all the structure in the word and say, okay, well, I'm going to use the story spine, which a lot of people call the Pixar pitch, which I think is kind of unfair, because the guy who invented it called it the story spine. Once upon a time and every day. Okay, fine. So once upon a time, I'm the person who kind of used to do that. Okay, fine, that's fine. But like, none of this is a story. These are facts about your life. What actually happened? That's going to be the core of that. Oh, it was this time I was at work. Okay, for now you found the story, we can put the structure in place. If you don't have the story, you can. So what I usually tell people is say, all right, so what is it that you want to tell me about? Okay, I want to tell you about how I believe that communication is essential to business. Okay, fine. What happened in your life that makes you say that? For many years, blah, blah, this has happened. Okay, fine. We're still not there. Can you just tell me about the first time you realized that was a thing? Or maybe the last time you realized that was a thing, or the worst time, or the best time. In one episode, one moment is actually going to come out. I know you're a big fan of moments. It's a big part of a TED Talk. So when someone finds the moment, it's like, oh, yes, there was this one meeting with my boss. Great. We found the story. Now, if we want, we can apply some structure to it. But before we find the story, I, I've just seen it too many times. People sit in front of a blank page, they have a structure in front of them, and they're like, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be writing here.
So what you're really asking them to do is get to the point. What is the point you are trying to make? And then take us to a moment in your life that demonstrates that point in action.
Yeah.
And once you've got that moment down, I always like to say, you're right, moments or stories about moments that last a lifetime. Those moments that have informed and changed who you are today.
Yeah.
So great. Then you get this down. And how do you coach people then to don't tell a story with and this happened and that happened, and it becomes non-narrative, and this is where structure really comes into play.
Sure. So I tend to tell people all the time that a story can be many things. Outside of business, a story can be many things. In business, or for what we call business here, to communicate in this way, a story is something very simple. It's a real life example that makes a point. So you should first find out what point you're trying to make, then find a real life example that backs that up. Is there always going to have a moment in it? Not always. Some people might actually tell you a story without what we call a moment, a scene. I tend to tell them, like, if you were to film this or put this on a theater stage, what would it look like? That's what I'm looking for. But what I tend to tell people is this: find the moment, okay? So we know the moment. We know where you want to end because we know what your point is. Now, start as close to the end as possible. I've seen someone describe it this way: if your story is about almost getting eaten by a bear, right? What a lot of people do is say, like, this much is the story, right? So imagine a very long line. The bear attack, in most people's stories, will come at the very last third of that line. And what you really want to do is you want to move slightly backwards from the bear attack and start your story there. So if my story was about a bear attack, I'm just going to start with the moment in the woods where I'm realizing something is wrong. Maybe I'm just like, I'm in my tent, I'm camping with my family, and I hear this noise outside, right? And then if I really feel that I need to add context to the story, I'm going to say a line or two between having started straight into the action and getting to the most important part. So figure out what your point you want to say, find out the moment in your life that leads you to that point, that taught you that point, and then start as close to that moment as you possibly can. If you do that, and if you throw in some dialogue, almost certainly your story is a million times better than the vast majority of people. Because when you add dialogue, you have to make it real. It has to happen in real time. And it just avoids the he said to me and then I said to him thing. I find that just by doing that, most people, if they actually have a story to tell, will be able to tell something that sounds pretty good. Lots of other
So you
things.
might start something like, we were camping with our two kids and I heard the sound outside and I was just certain that bear was going to eat us.
Yeah.
And then they go, whoa, and then boom, you backfill. And so Lisa Cron, who wrote Wired for Story, said you have to have a ball in play immediately, and that's the ball in play.
Yeah, I like to say to people, start as close to the end as possible and start with time and place, right? Or you can start with movement as well. Now, I find that for oral storytelling, for most people, they probably shouldn't try to do in media res, which is the traditional thing that you see in movies or TV shows all the time, where it's like Walter White from Breaking Bad. First scene is he's wearing no pants and a shirt and a gun, and he's in the desert, and you hear the sirens. It's like, what the hell is going on here? And then it backtracks. I find that in oral storytelling, that can be a bit confusing to people sometimes. So I would just say, I'm in the tent with my family. We're out camping, and I hear this noise outside the tent. I open it, and there's a bear. Right? Now, if you need to give me some background, do it right after you see the bear. I think you can pull off that the bear is about to eat me. Some people cannot. But as long as you start with time and place, as close to that moment as possible, then chances are you will struggle to waffle. because
Hmm.
that seems to be the case for most people.
We're talking about story structure, and I agree with you too. The hero's journey, it's too vast, it's too epic. People, unless you're a story theorist, can't do it. And I, of course, have my 10-step story cycle system, and it's complicated, but it's great for story strategy around developing brand stories. And we get back to the 5 primal elements of a short story, or as you mentioned too, the and, but, therefore. They are all structures, and I have found that the ABT is most powerful in business and organizational communications to overcome what you had talked about earlier. We go to a bar, we have a beer, we tell stories, we go to the office, we sit down, we are non-narrative, it's data, it's and, this happens. The nice thing about the ABT we have found is it takes that analytical thinking mind, that organizational business thinking mind, and said, look, here is a simple framework that you can apply to set up this point. What is the main point you were trying to make in this overall presentation? And then follow that with a quick little anecdote like you were talking about to show that point in action. But to your point, Francisco, is I can't agree more wholeheartedly than people need to replace or set up these data points and the logic, rational, reasoned communication with a story or stories, a narrative that takes an audience on a journey, transports them, just like you're doing in that bar over that beer. You want to win over that boardroom, that break room, that chat room, your living room, whatever, and you're going to do that with the power of a story.
Yeah, for sure. I do this thing when I'm delivering a keynote or training, which is I tell people, I want to apologize because what I'm gonna tell you now is gonna ruin your day. Some of you are gonna get angry, some of you are gonna get sad or frustrated. But, you've been warned. So I just share a statistic about how people every year thousands of people leave their jobs, and because they don't know what their rights are, they get taken advantage of by their employers, and that costs them money and causes them distress. And then if I'm doing this remotely, it's a bit easier to say, okay, can you just put down in the chat yes or no if I've ruined your morning? And you're never gonna get a yes, right? Like, and I say if there is a yes in there, is because me speaking to you has ruined your morning, not this particular data set point. And then I share the story of when my wife left her previous job and got shafted by her employer, right? It's the exact thing I just shared in a statistic. And then I asked them, how does that make you feel? And you get people saying, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm sad. Who are these people? I'm going to go talk trash about them on social media. And then I say to them, listen, um, you don't know my wife. You don't know that she's kind, she's lovely, she's definitely the better half of our relationship. So why would you possibly care more about something that happened to one person once more than something that happens to thousands of people every year? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. It's not rational. It's probably not a good thing, but it's human. That's just how our brains evolved to care. So if you want to bore people, only give them the facts. But if you want to move them to action, start with the story. Now, I'm not saying you don't give them the data, the numbers, everything else. You do, because you want them to know what they need to know. But if you don't give them the story, they just won't care. And if we don't feel something, we're never gonna do anything about things. So that's what I think people need to realize is like, it's not, the story is not enough data to prove anything, but the story is one data point that you share in narrative format to make people connect emotionally to the issue. Once they're connected, then you can bore them with the facts and the data and statistics, and probably won't be bored because there's context to it, right? But if you don't do that, then it's like they're thinking, where did you get those numbers? I've seen different numbers. I'm not sure if that's right? So we challenge the data way more than we challenge the story, which again is kind of crazy, but there you go.
Well, when you show up with the data, the facts, charts, graphs, and whatever, you are now positioning yourself as the expert, and that's all fine. You may be the expert in the room, but you're also setting up a divisive relationship, because now that audience is saying, okay, smart guy, prove it to me.
Yeah.
But they can't argue with a true story well told. They can't argue with something you experienced and a takeaway that you have. Say, this is my point of view, and here's why it's important. And then you bring in the data. to prove out to that logic, reason-driven brain that, oh, that journey Park just took me on, that moment that he just shared that created this aha about this business point is now backed up with the data.
Yeah, for sure. And a way I've thought about this before is that when you share data with people, or facts in general, you are trying to make a statement about the world, right? This is this way, this is that way, this is what happens when you do this thing or that thing. And if that clashes in any way with their understanding of the world, you now have friction there. Whereas when you share a story, all you're doing is sharing a piece of your world. Like, this is how I have experienced it. Like, I found that these people are great. And you might go, interesting, because I found that they were terrible. It's curious that you had such a different experience than me. Whereas if I say they are great or they are terrible, it's a statement
It's an
of
opinion.
fact, which you might disagree with.
Yeah, it's an opinion and an assertion, and people will argue all day long with that. So what's the biggest mistake people make in trying to tell a story?
There's probably more than one. I'm trying I change my mind about what is the biggest one that they make.
All right, let's go through the top 3 mistakes people make in telling a story.
So,
number 1.
So I think that the biggest mistake that people make when they tell a story is that they have absolutely no idea what their point is. And if you don't know that, you can tell a proper story. But I figured out what I meant when I set you up for that one. So the point is the biggest mistake, right? It's not so much that you don't know the point, is that you don't know how to support your point. And this is the thing I've noticed. A lot of stories feel like they have a point or a moral tacked on to them. And you listen to the story, you're not quite sure where it's going. And then the point arrives and you go, I'm not sure I follow. Like, how did you arrive at that? And what I've realized from listening to podcasts like this and studying a whole bunch of storytellers and then my own experience is that people don't do this very basic thing, which is work with opposites. Right. So if at the end of your story, you're going to be someone who learned how to work in a team, in the beginning of your story, you need to clearly be someone who doesn't know how to do that. So if you're clearly being, selfish, or you're just too afraid of asking for help or whatever, right at the beginning, and then later something happens to prove that you should ask for help and you do, and you make your point about that, we go, okay, I get that. There's a character journey there. You didn't know that. Now you know that. But if I exclude that first part, I'm like, okay, you learn how to work in a team, but did you not know that before? Because you never told me about that. And then even if the story was perfect and you just missed that like couple of lines that you could have used to set that up, then it just doesn't feel earned. The point of the story or the learning of the character or the transformation does not feel earned, and that just makes people not buy it. And that's often the most common mistake, or the biggest mistake people that actually know how to tell a good story will make, because they haven't paid attention to just this very basic thing of setting up opposites.
Interesting. Yeah, you've got to have contrast in a story, don't you?
Yep.
Again, like I love the structure of the ABT, because you have agreement, contradiction, build as much contrast in those two, then your audience is going to give you all day for the consequence of that, or your therefore statement. So you've got structure, but to your point, Francisco, you need to then overlay story and moments and anecdotes on top of that, so that Homo sapiens storytelling ape sitting across from you immediately gets you, because I do believe storytelling is the currency. Take the dollar bill, for instance. It's really worthless, but other than people have invested and bought into the story of what a dollar bill is worth.
Yeah.
So, they're invaluable. Now, you have been doing a lot of work in the TEDx speaker development world, and have had quite a lot of success with that lately. Some of your speakers are 97% more successful in engagement and sharing their stories because of What are you doing that are helping them so much?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things about that type of talk, sort of TED style talk that a lot of people don't get. Like they don't get the stats for one. Um, only 3%, only 3% of talks have anything like 10,000 views. The vast majority of talks languish somewhere in the 500 to 1,000 views, which means that it didn't really get out of your closest circle. And for a talk to do 10,000 views of more, you're really talking about the top 2 3% of talks worldwide. Um, we so I work with someone else, a guy called Brian Miller, and he had a viral TEDx talk a while back, one of those that explodes, does a few million views. Had no real idea why that happened, right? But there's a system now, and what we find is that a, a talk needs three things, right? And this actually applies to keynotes as well and other types of talks. So it definitely needs either an idea, if you're thinking of sort of the TED style world. It needs a story that gives you empathy with the problem of your audience and gives you authority to talk about that, because this is often a question that people are going to have. It's like, why are you telling me about this, right? Why do you care about this problem? So there's a story, and there is a logical argument that backs up the idea and the story with things that actually move people to action. Because what often happens is you can have a great idea, the idea sounds great, then you hear the personal story and you go, fine, great, I got how you got to that, that's very interesting, but I'm then going to come up with my objections, right? I shouldn't do it because of this, I shouldn't do it because of that. So what needs to be built into that talk is you need to show people they have nowhere to run, right? So normally people do this and it doesn't work because of that, or they do this other thing and it doesn't work because of that. So here's the status quo, and this is why it fails. Here's another bit of status quo for you, and this is why it fails. Once there's nowhere to run, people's minds are going to go, okay, so what's the answer then? And that's when you come in with your idea, with your paradigm shift, right? Well, actually, this is what needs to happen, this is the way to do it. And then you come in with your idea, and this is where you're bringing something new to the world, if it's a the TED style talk, or if it's a keynote, this is where you're telling your audience how they need to behave differently, right? And the difference there is one needs to be original, the other one doesn't need to be original, right? Um, but if you don't have that, a great idea and a great story won't necessarily make for a great talk. It might still go viral. There are a lot of talks. Like there's a talk last year that had 20 million views in 1 year, right? There is no idea to be found anywhere there, right? It's a guy telling a couple of stories. They're very moving, and that's it, right? Sometimes it happens. But if you actually want people to do anything about your idea, you need the idea to be super clear. If this was a keynote, then it's not an idea so much as a core message, right? What is that your people really need to take away? Because then they're going to forget almost everything. Let's be honest. They remember some of the stories. You ask them a week later, what was that talk about? If all they're saying is, oh, storytelling is great, have you really done our job? Probably not, right? They need more than that. And what we find, and what I find, is when you look at talks that are not necessarily sexy ideas, they don't have amazing stories behind them, and they still do very well, it's because the idea is incredibly simple and everyone can put it to action. So the latest talk I've had come out from a client, it came out in early June, and first couple of days were kind of, 3, 4, 5, 600 views, and we're like, okay, well, it's finding its feet. And then on the end of day two, it started picking up speed, and then it started doing about 1,000 views a day, and then it just started going crazy. It's when then end of June, there's an email that goes out with people collate the most popular talks in the world in the TEDx channel. This talk, which is called "Your Socks May Hold the Key to Aging Better," this talk had 175,000 views by then in 3 weeks, and it was the second most watched talk in the world. It's just
So that was the big
the
idea. Your
big
socks,
the big idea the
maybe.
big idea
Yep.
is the big idea was, if you don't want the last days of your life, the last years of your life to be the worst years of your life, you need to focus on balance now. Okay, that's it. That's the idea. She's a physical therapist. She thinks people talk about, cardio. They talk about weightlifting now a lot more. They talk about nutrition. Nobody talks about physical balance. But older people fall all the time. It's one of it's the leading cause of injury and injury related death on 65-year-olds, 65 year and older. And her basic idea is this: you need to start putting on your socks standing up. That's it. That it's a test and it's an exercise, right? So, do people remember all the things she tells them about balance? Probably not. But they remember that, and a lot of people we know, because we find out, we ask people, they start trying either during the talk or as soon as the talk is over, right? And that is the merit of a great idea. There is a story behind it. The story was important to sell the talk, but it boils down to a very basic idea. And we tell people, you might think that all you need is cardio. You might think that all you need is this other thing, but it's not enough. And this other thing is not enough. So then what is missing? And this is what it's missing. And that makes a massive, massive difference on if a talk is successful or not. And also, I would argue more importantly, if it actually does anything in the world. Because a talk is not, at least one of those talks, is not just for people getting views. That's nice. The authority that comes with it is nice. It's launching your speaker career, also very nice. But a lot of people care about these issues, right? And some of the people we work with, they have issues that are not commercial, right?
And did you help put together this socks
Yes, I was
TEDx talk?
I was the lead coach on that talk.
Yeah. So what was her opening line? And we'll put the link in the show notes too, so people can go and see it. So what was that opening line, and then what was the follow-up story, the abridged version of it?
So the talk opens with, when you put your socks on in the morning, how do you do it? Do you stand up? Do you lean against the wall, or do you sit down? Um, and then she says, believe it or not, the answer to that question might decide if the last years of your life are the best years of your life or the worst. And then she leads into the statistics about falls and asks the question, what if, we tend to think that frailty and aging are synonymous, but what if they not? What if they're not? And her story was that she talks about her mom, and how when her son was very small, her mom was this like super active old lady, and she used to feed the kid and put him down and carry him around, and she would do all this stuff in high heels. And then one day she was on the phone, lost her balance, and fell and broke her arm. And the doctors talked to her about fixing the arm, but never asked about like why she fell. They never talked about balance at all. And then her physical health started declining after that fall, as tends to happen with people of a certain age. And nobody ever talked about balance. Like, nobody thought about, why does this happen? Maybe we should take precautions to make sure this is not happening. So that was basically the story, right? It just sets the empathy with the problem that a lot of people in the audience have had themselves, or have seen happen with their parents, or are concerned might happen to their parents or to themselves. And then talks very briefly about her being a physical therapist for 20 years and blah, blah, blah. And that's it. It's not a terribly exciting story. It doesn't have this super impactful moment or anything like that.
But it's a surprising aha, though. Really, something as mundane as putting on my socks that I do every morning, if I just do it standing up, it could have a gigantic impact later in life.
So that's the talk. That doesn't come from the story. That comes in the talk. The story itself is just super relatable. It explains the problem very clearly. The audience can relate to it. Shows why this person is on stage talking about this thing. And you can go, and she drops that, even though I've been a physical therapist for 20 years by then, so okay, fine. She's already established her credentials without having to do anything else. Okay. And that's the only job that story was there to do. Now, some talks have a lot more story than that. Someone else I coached in a talk that has done very well so far, but nowhere near that well. I mean, it's 40,000 views, I think, in a couple of months. But this is a guy who he contracted a rare neurological disease that made him lose his balance, which was problematic because his business was being a paddleboard instructor. And basically lost his business, got into depression, almost took his own life. And then as he started getting back to health, he wanted to raise awareness for mental health. So once he felt a little bit better, he committed to being the first person to cross the 5 Great Lakes on a paddleboard. And he eventually did that. That got a lot of publicity and attention. And he got invited to do a talk. And he didn't have an idea, right? We had 6 weeks. We had to come up with an idea. We found an idea that we felt was very compelling. But that talk is way more story, right? That talk starts with him on the paddleboard crossing Lake Michigan, 27 or 28 hours awake, and knowing he's about to fail. And then he backs out of it. And then he talks about the thing in a more normal. That's how it's almost all story. There's some facts dropped in. But again, that is an incredible story. Like, you have to make a talk like that story more than anything else. But in most talks, as in most keynotes, there's only the story's there to do a job. It can't just be the story unless it's something like that.
Now, you've got an offer for our listeners to help them with their stories. And again, they don't have to be giving a TEDx talk or anything. This would be just presentation skills using the same secrets that you have learned in helping these others. What is that giveaway?
Yeah. So if they want to do, if they want to get on the red dot, if that's what they want to do, and they tell us that they've come to us through the Business of Story podcast, we'll give them $1,200 off our signature program, which is finding their idea, finding that story that backs that up, finding all the logical arguments that go with it, which is how we sell this to organizers. And then we help them apply and get invited. Once they're invited, we help them develop and deliver the talk. And then we teach them how to put that talk to use and market and do all the things it needs to do. If all they want to do is work on a keynote, just a more straight up speaking stuff, then we'll give them, what was the deal there? Then we'll give them $1,000 off that program.
And where do they find you?
Oh, that's a good point. That is a good point as well. The easiest way to find me, and then I can take you wherever you need to go. The easiest way to find me is to find me on LinkedIn, right? So I'm sure this is all going to be on the link on the show notes. I'm super accessible on LinkedIn. Find me on LinkedIn. Tell me what you're looking for. Tell me you've listened to me here, and I'll send you to the relevant places so you can see all the programs laid out and all of that stuff.
Well, that's awesome. Francisco, thank you so much for taking time out of your day, sitting in your daughter's room where it's peace and quiet from Barcelona to join us here on the Business of Story.
My pleasure, Park.
You know, I really love Francisco's approach to storytelling to help you share the point of your big idea and transport audiences into action. But you know what? A lot of stories are completely useless because they don't use proper narrative structure. They become a meandering mess and you lose your audience. That's why the ABT framework is so powerful as the DNA of story structure. Build upon the 3 words of and, but, and therefore that use the 3 forces of story of agreement, contradiction, and consequence. And all of your messages will land right the first time, every time, especially your big stories. I'll show you and your people how to grow as more confident and compelling storytellers with either an in-person or virtual training, or heck, we could even do a hybrid of those two. We call it the ABTs of Storytelling, and I would love to show you how. Just reach me at park@businessofstory.com, or you can start right now with our micro training course at businessofstory.com/ABT. Hey, a big thank you to Caden Howell, Marissa Hill, and Darius Holbert for our show's excellent editing, marketing, and music in that order. And thank you for listening to and sharing this edition of the Business of Story with anyone you know who needs to make their point quickly and compellingly. And who doesn't? Hey, I've got a really cool show for you next Monday, and it's about animals. I'm going to have Dr. Jessica Vogelsong, the medical director for the American Animal Hospital Association here. She wrote this terrific book called All Dogs Go to Kevin. She's an amazing storyteller, and she's going to be talking about how she is bringing story to the medical profession. Yeah, not humans, but pets, which might be even cooler. So I hope you'll join me then. And until then, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make that one spectacular. Thanks so much for listening.